Today I'll focus on a particular nexus of suspicion involving NGOs, volunteers, and the government. I'll explore how when Hindu scriptural ideas of the impulse to give and of disinterested giving intersect with contemporary notions of social responsibility and obligation, tensions manifest between an immediate impulse to end suffering and the social obligation to create a just society. And it's in this tension that we find the nexus of suspicion. I'd like to preface my talk with just stating the fact that in India today, religious donations confer no tax benefit to donors, unlike here, for example. And they're currently unregulated by the state. And I'll come back to this at the end of my talk because it's important. In an issue of a newsletter for NGOs in India called Accountable, a special issue was devoted to accountability in Hindu Daan. I use this example to illustrate that bringing concepts from Hindu scripture to the NGO world of Delhi is not an idea of my own. The newsletter first translated the Hindi word daan not into donation, but into gift or giving, and contrasted Hindu and Western ideas of giving. In the West, the newsletter explained, people remain attached to their donation. They remained interested in knowing how the money was used. In other words, they would like to get the satisfaction of having achieved the purpose of the donation. In Hinduism, in contrast, donors are required to detach themselves from the object that has been donated. Daan then requires tyag, or relinquishment of all proprietary rights in the property. This tyag cannot be achieved if we remain concerned with the outcome of daan. The newsletter explained, Hindu thought encourages a gradual detachment from the material world if one is to achieve moksha, or release from the painful cycle of birth and death. The act of giving is, therefore, an act of cutting off ties with the material world. It is an act of freedom. And herein is the dynamic tension between the freedom of the gift, which alludes to an eventual release from the material world, and the regulation of the gift. You've noticed so far, probably, that I've aggravated categories of charity, humanitarianism, and philanthropy. And I do this with analytical intent. In urban New Delhi, current conceptions of daan, which again translates as donation or giving, embrace the humanitarian objectives of charity and philanthropy as one. Classically and scripturally, daan is a disinterested gift, a gift without expectation of return. The Bhagavad Gita characterizes such a gift as being offered through desireless action, or nishkam karma. The quote that I'm going to give you in a minute comes from a commentary upon and translation of the Bhagavad Gita that was given to me by an informant in an interview. My informant said, after our discussion, you must take this book. Then you will understand its scriptural relevance. So this was a translation of the Gita. There should be no motive in charity, and there should be no aim, direct or indirect. Let those to whom you give be such that they cannot make any return to you. Just as when shouting toward the sky there's no reply, or nothing can be seen at the back of a mirror, or a ball when thrown on the water does not rebound in one's hand, or just as a wild bull is fed on grass, or an ungrateful person returns no obligation, charity should be without any idea of return. This is the supreme notion of charity. The inferior kind is that in where there's some other intention. It is like feeding a cow with the intention of getting milk, or sowing a seed with the intention of selling corn, or inviting relatives with the intention of getting presents, or sending sweets to friends expecting them to return them, or like working for others after they have paid the fees, or giving medical aid after charges have been paid. The gift at either end of the spectrum of impulse and obligation is problematic. There's a social danger if it's reduced to either pole. If the gift is left to its impulsive extreme, it has the potential to perpetuate inequality. For example, the wealthy can choose to support causes that benefit them, not those in greatest need, such as organizing charity bazaars that raise money for the poor but do not address the structural conditions that perpetuate poverty. In so doing, the wealthy, through their philanthropy, maintain the status quo and neither empower the poor nor promote social justice. But others argue that charitable and philanthropic endeavors answer a need, filling in where the state is unable to provide social services, often in spontaneous response to humanitarian crises. When the state is not involved in programs of social welfare, there's more pressure on philanthropy to solve social problems. Proponents of philanthropy argue that without it, given the declining role of state-sponsored welfare amidst global neoliberal economic trends, those in need will fall into even greater despair. The focus on long-term effects, or one could say social obligations of giving, sits at the other end of the spectrum from the impulse to give. For example, impulsive giving to beggars, like you saw in the slides, is not typically placed in the same category as giving to institutions such as NGOs, despite the fact that both forms of donation respond to human suffering. Religious philanthropy, defined here very broadly as a form of dawn, thus distinguishes itself from the legal context of social welfare, with its correlative entitlements. Writing on philanthropy and law in India has focused on the economic and legal regulation of the voluntary sector, particularly regarding foreign contributions to NGOs. Government attempts to regulate resources are attempts to regulate civil society. But giving also has a symbolic function. It provides a template for the actions of others. Philanthropy and institutionalized humanitarianism are sometimes seen as marks of civility, as more modern and rationalized form of giving than individual charity, which is described as impulsive without long-term effects. Giving as a mark of civility or progress and development, manifest in the ability to come to the aid of others' need, are also part of contemporary discourses of Indian national identity. And while I was in India in 2004-2005, India was vying for a seat on the UN Security Council, and after the tsunami, actually refused global aid, saying we are capable of being the giver. We do not need to be the recipient. And it was a geopolitical statement. There were lots of things in the paper about India giving before. There were nothing in the paper about charity. Does Delhi have a conscience? But then there were also divisions within. Not everybody was giving and getting equally. Caste was one division. Okay. For now. The humanitarian impulse, and here I draw upon the work of historian Thomas Haskell, who wrote about humanitarian sensibilities, contrasts formalized practices of regulated and legislative giving. In my talk, I situate a nexus of humanitarian effort in a post-tsunami India, in the context of both Hindu ideas of giving or dawn and current legislative attempts to regulate giving in the Indian voluntary sector. So it's a very complex political landscape. The ethnographic context is also one of trust, or rather mistrust, where the tension between impulsive giving and creating a just society manifests a nexus of suspicion. In certain evaluative frames, suspicion works as an audit to measure the effectiveness of a gift. My ethnographic tale today of a particular nexus of suspicion involves a posh school, a slum school, non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, the private sector, and the government of India. The context is the gift, specifically charitable giving for humanitarian relief after the Indian Ocean tsunami of December 2004. When the tsunami hit, I was in Delhi working on an ethnography of giving and humanitarianism. The India of my paper today is a nation with an aggressively liberalizing economy, aiming to envision itself as a superpower. It is also a nation with rapidly increasing economic wealth and new materialism among the middle class, alongside a tremendous growth in poverty. This social disparity is important to keep in mind as I narrate my nexus of suspicion, within which NGOs are primary characters. One estimate cites close to 1 million NGOs operating in India, although I've seen other estimates citing 2 million. But definitely India has the largest number of voluntary organizations operating in Asia. In contrast to my experiences with NGOs in Zimbabwe and North America, where they're generally considered to be doing good, in New Delhi I encountered a widespread culture of suspicion surrounding NGOs. NGOs were deeply distrusted in both public discourse and private views. This was not the case with the private business sector, which many considered to be trustworthy. In the NGO sector, while particular accounting forms may have emerged to take care of issues of mistrust, in the case of India, at least in its capital city, New Delhi, and think of New Delhi like Washington, D.C., it's the capital city, very political, the practice of auditing itself was distrusted. Today, I'll explore how the culture of suspicion is itself a form of an audit. If the audit is another way to discuss obligation and responsibility, questions arise as to whom NGOs should be accountable. As non-elected institutions in a democratic context of political engagement and social welfare, are NGOs accountable to their donors, the communities they serve, nation-states they collaborate with, or are they morally accountable to an ethical public? Soon after the tsunami hit the shores bordering the Indian Ocean, a wave of relief was rallied alongside a flood of social critique. Amidst the plea for public donations, which permeated the press, was the documentation of scandalous abuse. Newspapers were suddenly filled with reports of corruption by the government and NGOs. More than mere sensationalism, the discourse of corruption was an ethical commentary on the actions of the government of India and NGOs regarding social welfare. One could say that the media offered its own rituals of verification to its reading public, which took on a feverish pitch. The outrage voiced by the media at corrupt practices in humanitarian work provided an ethical critique of how such work should progress. By outlining what was not right, the articles alluded to what should be. In the first week, there are seats in the front if you want to come.
And feel free to sit on the floor.
On the floor, there's also,
And there's a chair here.
These are newly minted anthropology.
Please
students.
come in, please come in. Come in.
Come on in, folks. Don't be shy.
Here.
There's a seat here. Okay. In the first week of January 2005, the Indian Express ran an entire series of articles on corruption and tsunami relief. One article advised donors to be suspicious of con artists posing as charity groups. It suggested avoiding intermediaries and giving as directly as possible. Another article described how thieves, rapists, kidnappers, and hoaxers preyed on tsunami survivors and the families of victims. Another told the tale of how relief supplies to Nagapattinam were met with touts who posed as victims and hijacked the aid. These particular cases of misappropriation of aid fed into a larger critique in the press, written on the editorial pages. One piece rallied against relief efforts in the context of general social welfare. The government, quote, the government of India is being projected to deliver relief and facilitate rehabilitation of those affected by the tsunami. But how effective has it been in dealing with crises in normal times? End quote. The article continued with a provocative statement. After the disaster comes the accounting. The tsunami was a portal into a larger moral critique of the government, of NGOs, and of social welfare practices more broadly. The suspicion meted towards the government extended to NGOs accused of doing nothing or helping their families and friends, instead of those they were intended to serve. If NGOs in Delhi were situated in a nexus that contrasted suspicions of government corruption to a corporate sector model of accountability, NGOs embodied both the potential for corruption and the possibility of ensuring general good. That bribes are sometimes spoken about in terms of a donation, or dan, is more than a euphemism here. There's always a suspicion in donation practices that the gift will be misused. In both religious and secular contexts in India, whether referring to a conduit such as an NGO or a group accepting a donation directly, the receivers are responsible for justifying the moral worthiness of a donation and for demonstrating how the funds are spent. Perhaps to address and resolve issues of suspicion oriented towards recipients, many people I interviewed in the NGO sector said that in New Delhi and India more broadly, people wanted to help someone or some group with whom they had a relation. In other words, they wanted to see their assistance going to a specific site with which they were associated. whether a region that they came from or a special interest they had personal experience with, like the needs of the elderly or children in a neighboring slum. This giving was relational and not anonymous. It was direct. One could say it was the opposite of the more generalized efforts of humanitarian relief as exemplified by the tsunami disaster. In direct philanthropy, social networks function as the guarantor. People funded NGOs that they knew. Perhaps someone they knew worked for it, or had started it, or was on its governing board. To inspire more generalized giving in the frame of civil society, transnational foundations in Delhi were supporting programs that fostered disinterested social welfare, as opposed to these welfare programs that were more relational. The Ford Foundation's program on philanthropy in Delhi, for example, was part of its governance and civil society program. It supported NGO infrastructure, or in other words, NGOs that oversaw the accountability of other NGOs. In addition to issues of accountability and credibility, there was also the expectation of transformative results. If this form of giving was a crusade against corruption, it was, as one foundation officer explained to me, an audit for the sake of change. In Delhi, the field of NGO oversight was dense and highly organized. For me, it seems strikingly so. A website providing resources for Indian NGOs held a cyber forum on credibility, in which NGO experts gave advice on NGO good governance. I met with directors and employees of organizations in Delhi that were set up to help NGOs to be more accountable. This superstructure of institutions provided a moral conscience for the welfare sector in the absence of state regulation. Yet I was neither sure why it was so pervasive, nor why there was such an institutional urgency to its existence. Why was the NGO sector under such scrutiny when other realms of life were also pervaded by discourses of corruption? Was it the case of the messenger being attacked? Because NGOs advocated for change, it was easier to attack the NGOs for corruption than their aim of social transformation. Unlike government officials elected by and accountable to the public, the issue of accountability was ambiguous for NGOs. A foundation officer surmised, people feel threatened. They're like, wait a minute, the government is elected. Who elected you? Accusations of corruption in the NGO sector may have also stemmed from the historic allegiance that NGOs have had with the government of India post-independence. Many NGOs emerged in partnership with the state following Gandhian initiatives of voluntarism and service. During my research, however, the term mushrooming was frequently used to describe the growth of the NGO sector as something that was uncontrollable. As much as the contemporary state had a reputation for corruption, some of it had rubbed off on their NGO collaborators, damaging their perception in the eyes of a scrutinizing public. Over and over, I heard people say that while some NGOs were doing good work, most of them were not to be trusted. The comment, oh, anybody can start an NGO, and the rumors that NGOs were being set up for people to pocket money instead of serving a constituency circulated as frequently as stories of a master beggar that broke the limbs of the children of the poor and sent them off to beg. Whether or not these stories were true, and I did not have the opportunity to verify any of them, they were oft repeated with a sort of certainty that defies any explanation. It was the same kind of everybody knows certainty that I also heard in my research in Zimbabwe when people spoke about witchcraft. Have you seen it, I would ask, about malpracticing NGOs in India or witches in Zimbabwe? And here are the same responses. Oh, I haven't seen it myself, but I know it is true. What do these stories keep in check? These stories have a dual moral function. They circulate suspicion to keep corruption at bay and express, more indirectly, suspicion of contemporary institutions. Although foundations such as Ford worked against corruption, it was considered inevitable and to be a fact of life. Whether talking about chai pani or bakshish, both terms for political bribes, NGOs and the government morally mirrored each other. As often as the NGO sector was accused of corruption, NGOs accused the government of requesting bribes for grants. I was told that the going rate was 20% of a grant in bakshish for an NGO to get money from the government. The alternate was the corporate sector, which was considered clean in comparison. unlike here, for example. Perhaps it's the overt nature of self-interest in the corporate sector in India that garners trust, while altruism to strangers is considered a distrustful motive. A final piece of this puzzle is that NGO work, like employment in the government sector, is a relatively low-paying profession. In a liberalizing economy, the elitism of the upper and middle and upper middle class encourages people to work for multinationals instead of for government. Whereas earlier in India, working for the civil service was one of the most prestigious professions that offered unlimited social capital and power, in contemporary urban India, NGO and government salaries are much lower than those of the corporate sector. It's more prestigious and financially lucrative to work for a call center than it is to work for either the government or for an NGO. So at the confluence of NGOs, the state, and donors lies my nexus of suspicion. There are many such sites in Delhi, of which my portrait is just one example. I begin at the posh school where I sent my son, who happened to be 3 at the time, in central New Delhi. Shortly after the tsunami in December 2004, the school put out a call for mandatory donations of 500 rupees. My son's teacher accosted me in the hallway one day as I dropped him off. "Where's your donation?" "You have to give," she said. Some parents were concerned. "Where's the money going? What if I wanted to give money to another NGO instead of this one?" they asked. The NGO to which we had given funds was located near the school, and I soon learned that it was a literacy NGO and a vocational school that provided free education to slum children and to destitute women. The donation request reverberated in the national context. In addition to media reports of corruption in tsunami relief, Delhi newspapers were filled with lists of donors and headlines on the editorial pages, questioning whether the local philanthropic response to the tsunami disaster was a marker of a Maussian social solidarity. Were Delhiites really good givers? And those are some of the articles I showed you. Within this evaluative frame were, of course, questions of trust. The NGO to which parents had donated through the school had taken donations directly to a tsunami-stricken area because it trusted neither other NGOs nor the government relief efforts, and there were huge government relief efforts going on at the time. And many schools required mandatory donations. It was a kind of nationwide call for assistance. But meanwhile, the director of the school, which I'll call the posh school, was furious because the local NGO, which I'll call the slum school, had not provided any reports on how the money had been spent. Several plane tickets had been purchased, but where did the money go? One day, while discussing charity, the director of the posh school pulled me aside and explained in a muted tone that there was a lot of corruption in the third world. Lots of police, electricity, people wanting money. Lots of NGOs, the fishy ones, where we don't know where the money goes. In this context of suspicion, he had structured his support for the slum children. He said, "I hire the teacher. I want to know where the money goes. It's the same curriculum. The money's coming out of my payroll. Whatever I bring in terms of arts and crafts, the menu in school, it's the same for them. I feel the only way I'll be satisfied is if I micromanage the whole process. No matter how well managed it is, I don't trust where the money goes." And I should say that this director had an MBA from Harvard, so he was educated here of this school. His support for the slum children was a secret. "I don't want you to tell anyone about this," the director said. "We will have all these people asking for bakshish." If he advertised his charity, he would open the floodgates of request. At the director's encouragement, I visited the NGO, the slum school, to which we had donated for tsunami relief. The director knew about my research project and so you should just follow through. It ran a literacy program for children and computer typing and beautician programs for women. And it was involved in rehabilitating street children and medical camps for the urban poor. When he first began his work, the director of the slum school conducted a household survey in the neighboring slums. He was critical. "No use giving money directly to these people. They'll buy the wine. They'll buy the alcohol from the market, and they will not give the money to their family. That's the basic problem." He was also suspicious of other NGOs and of the government. He said 80% of NGOs were not operating properly. Many, he claimed, paid politicians before getting government grants. "Money doesn't go to where it should," he said. "Money goes to politicians." Immediately following the tsunami, the director of the slum school took it upon himself to fundraise for victims of the disaster in Nagapattinam district of Tamil Nadu. A fishing village, this area was one of the hardest hit on the Indian subcontinent. He'd gone door to door, collecting donations of utensils, pots and pans and silverware, rice, new clothes, books and stationery, and medicines. One day as I left the slum school, the director asked me to find someone to pay for the airplane tickets to take the tsunami relief packages, which were stacked up and tied in boxes, filling his office. He said, "Someone must go and make sure they are distributed properly." Although distrust was pervasive, the language of accountability did not seem to mollify it. One reason there was no trust was because there was corruption. The following week, I arrived at the posh school to talk to the director about the work of the slum school. A man sat in the director's office. When the director saw me through the glass door, he seemed irritated. He complained about the reporter sitting inside. The man was starting a program for kids in Rajasthan, a whole community, he said. He said, he heard I did this and now he wants my support. He was exasperated. I mentioned that I had just come from the slum school, and my comment seemed to enrage him. I soon saw the web of obligation that I was woven into. The director of the slum school had wanted me to ask the director of the posh school to support an event that he was planning at a 5-star hotel. Quote, "I don't want to do that event. I've told him 1,000,000 times. What part doesn't he understand? What did you tell him? We've given them so much money. Where has it gone? I want to see something from the government for taxes." I mentioned the receipts. "No, I want to see how they've used the tsunami money. Our parents need to know where their money went." That day, they were feeding slum children in a special event that was being videotaped. "That's my camera," he said. "I gave it to them. How much do they want from us?" I said, "Let's do something at our school, not at some 5-star hotel. It's getting too materialistic. Let's have his kids make some cards or wrapping paper and we can sell them to parents. I'm not doing that event." Or I said I'd sponsor some kids at our school, separate from regular classes, but here, why not? I was troubled by how quickly I became a pawn in their rally. My research that before had seemed so exciting and metaphorically beautiful, poetic even, with the rich and the poor schools and their relationship, had quickly become a social nightmare. He went on a rampage. "Where has all the money gone? He used to have 300 kids, now he has 80. Where did they go? What's happening?" He seethed with distrust. The posh school accused the slum school of not being responsible. The slum school accused the slum dwellers for not being responsible and not sending their kids to school. These are all issues of credibility. Things were neither what they seemed nor what was expected, and in such a context, giving was dangerous. It could quickly multiply to unlimited requests. The posh school wanted to keep its charity private and quiet, did not want to hold an event in a 5-star hotel, yet it wanted to collaborate with the slum school when the audience was the parents of its enrolled students. When philanthropy becomes a performance, kind of a ritual of verification, one must ask, who's the audience? Where's the stage? Who's on the stage? The nexus of the posh school and the slum school may have been a microcosm for relationships of poverty and need in Delhi, but it was not a binary relationship between donors and recipients. The slum school was also a donor. Suspicion was aimed in every direction. The government of India was also suspicious of NGOs and conducted inspections before giving grants. The director of the slum school recounted such an inspection with great frustration. Where was the money? Was it forthcoming? As much as grantors desired to follow their funds, potential grantees also questioned the money trail. If audits and inspections are rituals of verification, NGOs have other forms as well. There are specific performances geared to an audience of the public that serve to validate the institution. For example, the slum school did hold the charitable event at the 5-star hotel. It started with cultural programs and culminated in the release of a CD of the slum school's tsunami efforts. This ritual of verification between the NGO, the slum children, and representatives of the government was a plea for funding and a manifestation of intent. That the Honorable Chief Minister of Delhi was in attendance, a witness to the work as a distinguished audience member, was another form of social accountability and validation. The next time I visited the slum school, the director said things were not going well. The organization had had 7 inspections by the government of India, but had not yet received a grant. Apparently there was approval, but the funds were not coming through. The director had decided to embark on desperate measures. He was going to present legal action against the government. I think it's because of corruption, he said. If I pay 20% my grant in aid will be cleared. People have asked, if you give me something, can I get your proposals? I can get your proposal signed. He asked me to come and speak to the government on his behalf. He was, when I arrived, writing a letter to the Honorable President of India. 80% of the problem will be solved with your presence, he said. If we go, they will just say, we will see. I know the government of India. Your presence is most important for us. If you come with a reporter, they will not do this. The press and the foreigner were embodiments of the audit, and I was embedded. At that moment, he seemed a desperate man with an organization on the verge of collapse. At a table behind us, a board member wrote a handwritten letter to the President of India. The landscape of suspicion also creates concern in foreign donors who expect their funds to go to those most in need. To counteract distrust, donors go to unusual lengths to give directly and to track their funds, often bypassing both NGOs and the government of India. I met with an American doctor who knew India very well. He had been spending money to purchase AIDS medicines for 4 people through a doctor in India. This American doctor came to India to present a paper at a medical conference and to volunteer his time in an AIDS ward. And he took the opportunity to meet with the doctor to whom he'd been sending his money. He told the doctor he wanted to meet the patients who were being helped by his donations. He had agreed to give these patients, through the doctor, AIDS medicines annually for as long as they needed it. When he got to Delhi, he was surprised to find that 2 of the 4 people being supported by his donations lived very far away. He could not understand how the Indian doctor had selected the people to receive the medications. The American doctor met a couple for whom he had provided HIV medications. They were from the same region as his friend, the Indian doctor. The doctor was also providing medication for a person in Sri Lanka and one in Nagaland. Far off from Delhi, the American doctor said to me. I was puzzled why he was treating patients so far off when there are so many people needing care in Delhi. As a foundation officer in Delhi explained, in India, people practice direct philanthropy, which is relational and not utilitarian. The good, utilitarian being the good for the greatest number. People seek to give to someone that they know with a specific outcome, instead of to a general cause. For this American doctor, he said, when you do this kind of work, it's for yourself. Even though you're helping people there directly or indirectly, it's the personal satisfaction you get that is the real motivator to do this work. But second, it is to see, where's the money going? Is it being used appropriately? Sadly, I think when they know you're coming, they'll be a little more motivated to make sure it's going to the right place. He used an unusual method to raise funds in the U.S. to pay for the medicines of HIV patients. As a doctor, he received surveys from drug companies to see how doctors were prescribing their medicines. Rather than rejecting the survey and its payment, he completed the surveys and used the money to send HIV drugs to the few patients in India. And he received between $100 and $150 a month for the surveys. He worked with this doctor in India who was associated with an international charity, an NGO, but it wasn't through the NGO that this money was going. The doctor in India had an ATM card. The U.S. doctor deposited money in an account from the U.S., and the Indian doctor withdrew it in India through his ATM card. So it was really direct. Right? Not direct to the patient, it's direct to the doctor. The U.S. doctor considered it kind of an experiment. The reason he was doing it this way was that it was direct. If I go through the organization, they'll take 20% off the top. Coincidentally, this is the same figure Delhiites were counted as the amount requested for bribes. If instead of giving funds directly to the doctor, he had organized his donation through the NGO, he said, of course, then you could also write it off in taxes. So it probably would be better if we went through that organization. But I thought, just as an experiment, let me go directly through him, and then he doesn't have to ask for permission or anything. Unquote. Yet he had entered into an experiment that he could not easily end, for he had lifetime obligations to his patients in India. Once you cover someone with HIV medicines, he said, to say no to them would be pretty harsh. In a sense, I've made a lifetime commitment, and even though at the time you don't know that you're making that. He compared this kind of a commitment to child sponsorship, where at a certain point the child one sponsors grows up and the obligation of support ceases. He'd always sponsor the child, which would in his experience, the sponsorship would typically last for about 15 years. He visited one of the children he sponsored to see if this money was actually going to where it should be, and for the most part, it was, I think. But with the children he sponsored, there was an endpoint to his support. It was interesting. Yeah, very sweet little girl. She's grown up now and graduated from the program. I have no idea where she is now. I sponsored another one in between her because I think they got into it when they were about 8. So she graduated. Like the children he sponsored, this doctor had come to Delhi partly to meet with and check up on the Indian doctor he gave money to, and the patients for whom the Indian doctor was providing HIV medicines. The Saturday following our discussion, the American doctor was scheduled to meet 2 of the patients. He was a bit ambivalent about this meeting. He said, initially I didn't want to do that, but then when the Indian doctor mentioned it as a possibility, I thought maybe it's best that I talk to the patients, saying, are you actually getting the meds? I'm not there to get a thank you. Oh, thank you, doctor. I don't want to meet that. I just want to see, are you getting your meds? Are you getting them on time? Because that's essential for HIV. If there was a lapse in the medications, the patients would acquire resistance and they would no longer be effective. The American doctor did not know how the Indian doctor had chosen the patients to support, and he was skeptical. I thought they would be treating, what I would have picked myself was a widow who has children. He had his own criteria of need that did not match that of the Indian doctor. Nevertheless, he trusted the Indian doctor enough to keep sending funds for the medicines. Aside from funding HIV medicines for the life of these 4 patients, the American doctor was involved with a clinic in Ahmedabad in northern India. The clinic was treating thousands of HIV patients, each of whom they charged a small fee, literally a rupee or 2 rupees. For the American doctor, this payment was also a type of accountability. The clinic charged, as I said, 2 rupees. They felt the patients were more motivated to comply with the therapy when they had to pay for it. This is similar to other development schemes that I've encountered where those being developed contribute some form of investment, whether labor or materials, to the development project. The American doctor saw his work sponsoring the 4 patients as being more efficient than NGO work. He was able to bypass the marketing costs of a large institution and give the funds directly. His primary concern was, where is the biggest bang for my buck? And this is something in the larger context of my book that I'm really investigating, is this kind of direct humanitarianism or direct philanthropy. How could his donations go the farthest? He was critical of organizations in the U.S. that used a lot of money for marketing, and he was proud that he had managed to bypass this. Quote, I've even improved that by bypassing all the marketing by sending this money directly for medicines to a friend of mine. It was precisely the direct relationship that he had with his friend that made the direct funding possible. The next section is called Regulating the Gift, or Suspicion as an Audit. A discussion with a local officer for a transnational foundation in Delhi confirmed my hunch that post-tsunami, mistrust of NGOs had increased. People were concerned with the question of who to give their money to. In his line of work, he was cautious. We're permanently on guard that we're not being ripped off, he said. The foundation did not trust Indian financial audit systems and arranged for an annual international audit. His mandate was to check each organization. Are they transparent on their governing board? Do they have a gender policy, a sex harassment policy? Do the governing boards meet regularly? We fund organizations to help them run better and develop their capacity to be more efficient, he explained. Yet the overarching sense of mistrust was fed by the very process of monitoring and evaluation that his foundation enforced. While NGOs thumped on his desk saying, you don't trust us, the foundation wanted to know at the end of the grant what was being achieved. The foundation was not happy giving away $250 million to the world. It wants to say, with $250 million, what has changed? It was focused on results, and as such, by focusing on results, it was focusing on change. And this is key. It wasn't the audit for the sake of an audit, it was audit for the sake of change. Some NGOs resisted the foundation's quest for measurable results. The director of one NGO in particular had been refusing measurement models, and the foundation was unlikely to continue its funding. The NGO did not give a narrative of what it had achieved. The foundation officer explained, I understand, but I can't bring that into my boardroom. I need to give a narrative of what has changed. Without indicators of success, the foundation was compelled to measure the impossible. Measurement was an essential component of evaluating change and of the audit itself. I spoke with another man who I'll call Mr. A, who ran a private consulting firm that provided accounting, financial management, and regulations compliance services for NGOs. There are tons of organizations overseeing NGOs. This organization charged fees from donor agencies for its services, so Oxfam could give to this organization to make sure that the organizations that Oxfam was giving to were getting its money, for example. For Mr. A, the term accountable was insufficient in the Indian context. Because he published a newsletter for NGOs in Hindi as well as in English, he sought an appropriate translation. He considered uttardai, which meant answerable, but then he realized he was still working in what he considered to be a Western framework. When someone gives money, you're accountable to them. Instead, he decided to use the term lekha yog, which is part of yog, which roughly translates as a combination of practice, discipline, devotion, and union. For example, in the Hindi online dictionary, there are 24 definitions for the term yog. Very complicated term. Lekha yog is not enforced by an external agency, but rather it's brought about from the inside. It's a spiritual answer, being answerable from within. By spirituality, he explained, we do not mean religion. Instead, he meant responsibility, purity, clarity. Instead of religion, which he considered to be a particular way of worship, Lekha Yoga was dharma, or a sense of duty, or a righteous path. For Mr. A, the Western world was dependent on external regulatory logic, where the Indian world was more self-regulatory. Karmpal, the fruit of your action, or in English we would call it karma, was the effect of this alternative regulatory potential. He said, Karmpal will find you after millions of years, as a heifer will find its mother in a big herd of cows. When you do something in this life, you remain accountable for it. You will get rewards in this lifetime, or the next, or 100 lifetimes later. This accountability was not restricted to this lifetime. Philanthropic action in the Indian context, and according to Mr. A, was not philanthropic in terms of love of mankind. People gave philanthropically in terms of dan. Dan is your dharma. Giving is a duty. This concept of dharma, or duty, was an action-oriented code of conduct, a spiritual duty that translated into prescriptions for daily life. When one donates according to duty, the ideal form is secret and anonymous. In Hindi, gupt dan is one version for anonymous gift. When we talk about donation loses power, he said. When we want eternal benefit, we should not tell people about it. Mr. A translated the secrecy to the NGO sector in India, which was keeping public knowledge of its funds discreet. He was critical of Bill Gates, who had recently given a corporate donation of millions of dollars for AIDS in India. He was doing it because XYZ, corporate social responsibility, is a mocking of social responsibility. He saw rudiments of this concept in Indian giving. Indians won't tell you where and how they're giving. There's a privacy about disclosing donation. They will not tell you. Now in India, an enormous amount of donation takes place according to religious conceptions of dan. Giving in secret conflicts with Western assumptions of transparency and accountability in the NGO sector, also known as ethical practices. That's what we would call them here. NGOs were created in a Western model. In India, people do charity directly and locally, he said. Organized charity is not the way. You do it and forget it, dan. NGOs in India are structured around the Western model to take advantage of money flowing into the country, but many local NGOs are not able to tap these funds. As Mr. A said, somewhat ironically, Hindu organizations were considered untouchable by Western agencies. When Indians donate to religious organizations, they don't get a tax break. And in this way, from the perspective of transparency and accountability, religious charities completely underground. The language of the external audit was not translatable to the language of Hindu donation, of inner regulation. Of course, many in the NGO world considered the funds used for religious gifts black money, money earned illegally that people did not want to account for. However, for Mr. A, the expenses of external auditing practice were themselves scandalous. The bulk of money is being wasted because of the inherent wastage of the corporate charity model, wasted on overheads. The corporate model promises efficiency, which is precisely what you don't get with the corporate model. Mr. A was part of the online NGO Credibility Forum. In addition to measuring internal controls, accounting systems, and the financial environment, risk measurement, remember he was an accountant. Risk measurement for Mr. A included the gut feeling of people monitoring programs. And he made up an arithmetic model for this. His arithmetic model integrated and it calculated intuition to see how efficient an organization could be. For Mr. A's organization, credibility involved making realistic plans for both donors and NGOs. He said, "To us, credibility is not about accounting standards and vouchers. It's about doing what you say and saying only what you can actually do. The key credibility indicator is your results against plans. The truth is that plans are also susceptible to influences in the external environment." Such extraneous forces included the quest for funds and media pressure. In other words, both donors and the media fed a certain inflation of possibility that cultivated the environment of suspicion. In urban India, the fact that most philanthropy in Dawn is informal and unregulated is an issue of great concern for the government of India. The ethnographic cases I detailed today don't fit squarely into the regulated sectors of NGOs in India. While some donors prefer to give to institutions because of the guarantee, whether it's warranted or not, of accountability, others are suspicious of those very same institutions and are concerned that their money will go to a good end. Still others desire that their donations will not be squandered away, for example, by governments. Some of the slippage between accounted for and unaccounted for donations may be explained through the idea of the religious aspects of Dawn and the legislative dilemmas that ensue. As mentioned earlier, donations to religious organizations don't give you tax benefits, and I think this is really crucial. This makes sense in the idea of Gupt Dawn or anonymous Dawn, which is a very high form of giving in terms of receiving merit. There's intentionally no accounting, right? It's the giving without a return. And there's no relationship between the donor and the recipient, something which is said to afford greater merit. A study on donation in India was conducted by the Center for Indian Philanthropy, offered some statistics, and these statistics are striking. I have some slides with some numbers here. On the lack of accountability of religious philanthropy in India. It concluded that most giving to charity in India is informal and ad hoc. 77% of donations were given to individuals in distress, known to oneself and to beggars. And this was a multi-city, random sampled, stratified sampled study. So these pretty good research project. Only 21% of donations went toward organized or secular charity of all donations. Activists in the voluntary sector find it problematic that informal ad hoc charity takes precedence over giving for long-term change and development. So there are debates in the voluntary sector about this. Here we go. So, I'll just narrate some of this. It's a lot of information. But I wanted to put it up here so to remind myself to give you some of this information. So many people give these religious donations at religious shrines. There are particular religious places to give it. And it's not accounted for, like you don't get a receipt. For example, one of the most famous temples in India receives about $41 million annually in cash donations. That's a guesstimate. Pilgrims to these shrines also and temples donate gold, jewelry, and other valuables. The sale of hair donated by pilgrims comes to an additional $4.6 million annually. The Mata Vaishno Devi Shrine in Jammu has an annual income of about $16 million annually from offerings by devotees. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? This is just what's been studied, but there's so much more, and everybody knows about it and participates in it, but there's no registration as a 501c3 for these kinds of organizations. It's totally different structure. Here is an example of, for Gupt Dawn, you give in a box. For anonymous Dawn, it's like tithing in a church, I guess, would be the parallel here. These are from Haridwar. So the legal context of giving is also very complicated. There are 9 laws that govern nonprofits. As I said, you don't just register as a 501c3. Some of them are colonial laws still in effect. Some of them are post-colonial, independent India laws. And to register as a nonprofit, you can choose, and you register with your state. They're also state-based legislation. So there's the Public Trust Act, the Societies Registration Act, Indian Companies Act, the Charitable and Religious Trusts Act. See the ones from the 20s are colonial legislation. The ones after 1951, when the Constitution was written, are the post-colonial legislation. So it's an amalgam of laws. Very complicated, very secular Constitution that allows for all different religious law within its law. So here we go. And something else that I've been working on is this idea of a trust, which the idea of trust relates to the idea of a trust, right? Which is the basis for some of this, the corporate structure. And trusteeship comes from England ideas of the corporation. Heading now, I'm going to give you my conclusion. And this is a Vedic Sukti that one of my informants told me. And I haven't been able to find a source, and I can't say it in Sanskrit. But it translates as collect with 100 hands and give it away with 1,000. So in conclusion, as I hope to have demonstrated today in my talk, the audit can take many forms, not all of them bureaucratic. While in a tight-knit social group there may be social pressure for ethical practice, discourses such as media accounts of corruption offer a similar refrain. Such accounts paint a moral backdrop for the densely populated landscape of actors engaged in social welfare in New Delhi. I'm not arguing that Delhi is more corrupt than other places. We can look at our own context and see plenty of examples of misuse of public funds. But in Delhi, mistrust is more of a public event. It's more public than giving itself. If one trusts family and known others, one does not automatically trust strangers. Thus, to form an NGO with strangers, to avoid nepotism, and to give services to strangers, again, the kind of neutral other, is somewhat antithetical to Indian concepts of service to society. Seva, service, is often toward a known other. Traditionally, it's to a guru, or people do seva to an elder, a family member. One does seva for specific others as a sign of respect. There are other types of seva as well, like seva to the nation, the Gandhian idea, and voluntarism with NGOs is often discussed in this kind of a context. The nexus of suspicion formed between the posh school, the slum school, and the government of India and individual patron donors is one example of a context for the audit. The gift that does not require a return, dan, is one form of philanthropic practice. The gift that demands a return is another. Call it coercion or social obligation. This form of giving also serves society, but it's not quiet. It's the gift that is offered in the form of development and social services by NGOs that requires rituals of verification. Whether in the form of an internal regulatory process, lakayog, external audits and site visits, or the demand for a receipt to track where the money goes, the efforts of NGOs are bolstered and hindered by demands for regulation. In New Delhi, this regulation is not colonized by the state, although this too is in transition as the state attempts to gain more control over the fields that NGOs engage with and the funds that support them. In India, one could argue suspicion is a reaction to the liberalizing frame in which greater disparities between rich and poor are marked by opacity as to why and how. I do not think this is a useful analysis. Just as witchcraft in Africa is not new, perhaps it has achieved a more intense valence due to global capitalism and increasing economic and spiritual insecurity. In India, suspicion is also not new, and it is very commonplace. The wealthy and the poor use it as an evaluative frame to mark those who one knows, hence the capacity for trust, and those one does not. Why is the audit rational, bureaucratic, economic, associated with truth? Why are other forms that are less verifiable, with observation being the primary vehicle for ethnographic understanding, considered alternative or occult? Both witchcraft in the African context and suspicion in the Indian context are moral languages of evaluation, of social obligation, and of responsibility. Thank you.
The assumptions about money given, good works that are going to be imparted, and then that American doctor whose own matrix was not in convergence with the Indian doctor. They were going to reach HIV patients, but he had a different calculus for whom to reach. So there's a lot of liminal spaces within this economy of giving.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you. I don't hear a question.
Well, I'm wondering how are people producing verifiable results, and does that actually decrease suspicion? Because it sounds like not.
Well, I think suspicion is what I'm arguing is that suspicion is itself a form of the audit, right? The fact that people are distrustful of institutions, and that's why. I mean, the whole logic of the faith-based initiative here was partly that these faith-based organizations are going to be more deeply embedded in communities. They're going to know people that they're doing outreach with, right? That's the direct philanthropy that I'm talking with, right? That you're not going to give it to an institution; it's just going to get lost in the institution. But the institution is going to have a relationship with people and want to carry it through, and that I think what. On the one hand, the relational nature of giving goes against the whole idea of our ideal of philanthropy, right? That you give it to strangers. You have no interest. I mean, the idea of Don is very much like our ideal of philanthropy. You don't. Corporate social responsibility is not to get publicity. The ideal is not to get publicity for the organization to increase its profits, right? That's kind of dirty philanthropy, people say. The ideal is that the institution somehow really cares to do good, and it's not about some form of self-interest. But then at the same time, the only way to truly mollify all this anxiety about results is to have these relationships. So it's a paradox, right? It's a kind of a paradox. The one thing I do notice is that here in the U.S. we really tend to trust our institutions more than we will trust people. In India, people trust people. And they really don't. Maybe it's because institutions don't function as well, or they're just more people. Don't know why. But there's a different calculus going on. Many people here would rather give their money to an NGO because they get tax breaks, right, than a homeless person on the street. Question.
Thank you so much. This is something of a follow-up. In the part that you were just saying about institutions, perhaps we can think through a little bit more what kinds of institutions, because when you're talking about the numbers of people who give money to shrines, in some ways that's a sort of institution too. It's a more embedded one into the culture and is something in between the direct that you're talking about.
Right.
And so maybe we can begin to unpack where some of these differentials lie, not only according to a nexus that's a little bit more differentiated than relational private versus institution.
Yeah.
That has sort of more categories to it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are tons of categories. A lot of these religious institutions also have charitable wings. Temples also have charitable medical clinics,
Right.
Western or Ayurvedic, right? I mean, so and they're doing the same kind of work as NGOs, or they'll provide education, free education for local slum kids, like the NGO. So there are many facets and many sites, it's infinite number of sites. I mean, what I found myself studying when I was doing my research was in sort of informal giving, unofficial giving, giving that went around where people, situations, and this is one piece of my much bigger project, but people went around official channels because they felt like they had to just do something, right? They felt compelled to do something. That's the impulse. So foreign women who find themselves in New Delhi because their husbands are working for like USAID or some business, and they have nothing to do, and they're shocked by the poverty that is everywhere, and they feel like they have to do something, so they start a hugging circle in an orphanage, or they arrange to have orphans who have deformed faces get free surgeries so the orphans can be adopted. So that kind of spontaneous, there's so much of that going on that's not part of the landscape of what we call the nonprofit world, right? That was really interesting to me, and I spent a lot of time just following people doing that. Everybody's doing that, and people give dawn not only to temples. People give dawn outside their door. People give water outside the door every day. I mean, people have all sorts of ways to give. Giving is a part of life in a way that is not necessarily institutionalized, but it's very lively.
You mentioned that in the private sector, the multinationals are the most prestigious places to work. I'm curious, in the NGO sector, is there any difference between how international NGOs are perceived versus domestic NGOs?
Yeah. I mean, there is. There's legislation that was started, the Foreign Contributions Regulations Act started during the emergency in India, which tries to control foreign money into NGOs. So there's what do you mean by difference? I guess I don't know what you mean by difference. I mean, I know there's sort of an economic landscape. There's a huge difference, right? The budgets are much larger for the foreign NGOs than for the local ones.
In terms of people trusting that if there's corruption or not.
Yeah, I think they would probably trust a foreign NGO. Yeah, the language of distrust is a local language of relations, and it has to do with the language of the government too. It's a kind of social critique of the government, and also the history of the government and NGOs, because as far as I can tell, the NGOs, these sort of spontaneous giving was active long before the British got to India, and then the British were kind of threatened by it and started legislating these societies, because there were also the political societies that were forming, and so that's when all the colonial legislation started to be formed. People got around it, and then after independence there was this sort of nationalist movement to build India, and part of that was through cooperatives and community-based organizations, very much a Gandhian kind of initiative. And then after during the emergency, Indira Gandhi created another legislation, this Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, to try to regulate all of the potential for political activism, right? Because it was very vibrant. There's been this history with NGOs in the state of growth and then trying to regulate it, and that's happening right now too. And it has something to do with India trying to be a superpower, right? That's why I framed it that way. Yes?
I guess I want to tie into that political dimension in asking this question. I thought this was a fantastic presentation. But questions kept coming up in my mind about the impact of global organizations that are engaged in philanthropy. In the African context, 10, 15 years ago, you heard a lot of discussion of government by NGO, and a lot of suspicion on the part of many people that the non-governmental organizations were not really so interested in charity as they were preempting the government's capacity to move development in a certain direction, and that their giving was designed to appropriate political space as well as economic space. I'm wondering to what extent that was true in the areas you saw, a lot of that critique was focused on the United Nations, on UNIFEM, and that appropriation of space for women, say, and development was seen as an attempt to preempt the government's control over the direction of movement in those realms. So could you address that for India at all? Was that a concern? To what
You know,
extent?
yeah, and no, it wasn't a concern. I mean, as I said, India has such a vibrant sort of community-based, there are just millions of NGOs doing, and tiny, small, I mean, and localized organizations that are sort of outside the total purview of the government. And when I did my research in Zimbabwe on Christian NGOs and relationship with the state, it was such a totally different situation. Part of it was the World Bank structural adjustment programs and its history in Africa, which one of the conditions of giving loans by the World Bank were to reduce the state, right? And so the NGOs, the money kind of went to the NGOs to do the work of social welfare that these newly independent states, which had, civil servants, population of civil servants had grown, so the civil servants shrunk. And the number of civil servants shrunk, and the NGOs sort of stepped in, I think kind of pacified people, so they weren't saying things are not going well. I mean, that's a whole, it just seems to be a totally different kind of a history. Because India is liberalizing now. I mean, and it is having there is a kind of neoliberalism that is going on, but it doesn't have the same relationship with the UN, World Bank, and...
I guess I thought about it with respect to the tsunami.
Yeah.
Because there was the example where the global giving, the UN and its member states all giving, was that opposed at all because it was the appropriation of some political space, or is that just...
Well, India, at least the political language was that we don't need it, that we are the givers, that we do not, that there were actually, I wish I could have brought a slide of this, they were kind of accounting of what the Indians were giving and then what other nations were giving, and India saw itself as a player, as a giver, right? And in the African context, African nations have been the receivers, no question. So, yeah.
I was interested in the person that you quoted, I can't remember who it was a relationship between intuition as a marker for efficiency. And so it doesn't entirely surprise me, given other work that I've seen done on sort of the ways in which people mark the economy, try to read and interpret the economy, and that becomes a more interpretive way of doing it. And I was wondering, is there a relationship that you see between sort of intuition and suspicion? Is there something to be worked out there? I'm not sure what it is, but it seems like there's something going on.
Yeah, I think there is. I think that's what builds trust, is people have some kind of intuition. I mean, again, think about how do you trust how do we trust organizations? We look through at the bottom line, we want to see the spreadsheets, we want to see the annual reports. We require charitable organizations in this country to have our annual reports, right? There's no such process there. Americans have, and it didn't occur to me until I was in India doing this research, how much trust we have in America with institutions. Banks, which now I think we should not have been trusting so much. The banks, we trust our government, we do. We want to trust, we really do not have the same discourse of corruption with our government the way other places. It doesn't mean that there is not. I mean, there are always examples of people who are embezzling money or hiring their friends for major contracts. I mean, we have examples of that too, but it's not the dynamic discourse. But just what's interesting to me is what creates trust. Is it a spreadsheet? Is it a relationship? And I think that it's something that could be thought through in terms of charitable practice. And then Alana.
I think that church organizations don't have to make a report. That, like the Red Cross would have to.
But they do.
But voluntarily if they want to.
But church, I studied World Vision in
Yeah.
my previous project, and World Vision has really sophisticated annual reporting, partly because it receives it receives taxpayer money. So it has to say that's not being used for religion, right? That's being used for something. I mean, the reporting is super sophisticated in that organization. I mean, I don't know if your local church that sends money to a parish in Africa has to do an annual report, but organizations, large-scale charitable organizations, if you're a 501c3 in this country, I think you have to file an annual report. You don't think so? Does
I'm thinking
does Catholic Relief
Services does. They're very proud of the fact it's only like 6% overhead.
Yeah.
But they say that you can't look it up in a ranking. There's not a similar thing for church ranking as there is, and I guess I was getting at the trust idea of institutions.
Right.
That somehow we trust the churches more.
Yeah, that's it. I wonder. I'd like to.
That's what I was asking earlier too, that there's so much, there is an excessive amount of trust imparted in the American context to, I think, NGOs, period, compared to the Indian context, but in particular to faith-based NGOs.
Mm-hmm.
And when we then look at the verifiable accounts,
Yeah, interesting. So you think it's unwarranted because it's the faith? You think the faith-based nature kind of masks?
yes,
the-
and it
Interesting.
reduces suspicion, and it almost becomes unseemly. I mean, a lot of these organizations now, right? They have these weekend retreats, and they are cons. They are weekends of like meet and greet and learn the issue, but it is really all about getting money.
from the
And-
government.
No, from individuals
Oh.
to these faith-based organizations, and they're going to then send this money around the world.
But they don't send the money around the world.
Well,
Well, I think they do, but the question is the cost of the overhead.
Right.
How much?
It's a wasteful practice.
and just the assumption, I mean, thousands of people will fly in for these retreats from all over the country. They're spending their leisure time. They're not necessarily rich people. This is in their off time. This is their disposable income, and they're just handing it over because they believe what they're told in the prayer room on Bolivia. They believe what they're told on the prayer room in, India. And I think that if that were a conference on giving in the, to different NGOs in Africa, and there was a room on poverty reduction and a room on HIV, I think people would be like, well, I'd like to see some numbers on this, not
Right.
just, say your prayer. And I don't mean to,
No, it's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
there's a lot of money, there was a lot of money circulating under the past 8 years from private donations to huge NGO, huge international players that were faith-based.
Well, I mean, World Vision partly fundraises in churches.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not at church sponsorship, but also exactly that format.
Well, to pick up on that, that was so significant that there were a number of African countries that actually began to crack down on the faith-based organizations that were engaged in charitable giving because it was seen as the institution itself building up. I talk about it as political space, but
Yeah.
in which to control a population
Yeah.
that the government perceived as being its natural constituency. And so it created a lot of political turmoil in some areas.
Right. I mean, can both these this. I don't like the
The
third
historical
set.
context, I think.
Yeah, it's
The
important.
colonial context, all of that. I
It's
think,
all very important.
makes a lot of difference.
But I don't think this idea of the third sector is very useful. I think that we should rethink that whole concept because it's the way that NGOs depend on the state depends on NGOs cannot create these divisions. Right? Alana, did you want to say something?
Well, I was wondering, and this sort of falls on some of the things about religion, but to return it back to the Indian context, I was wondering about if 77, something you said, percent of the giving is to these religious shrines or institutions. What is does the language of suspicion have any relevance
Oh, yeah.
there?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And people, in my research, I also found that some people didn't want to give to Brahmins in temples. They were giving to orphanages so they could go and visit the children, make sure that the children. So it's changing, right? And the government's always also trying to get some its fingers on some of those resources, right? Those incredible resources. So, yeah.
But what is what is the dominant kind of structure of relationship or concern? What are people concerned about or not concerned about in
Well,
giving?
when you
in
give
this
to when you
context?
give to when you give to a shrine, it is dawn, and you are not concerned because you are giving away, right? The whole point is to be free of the relationship to your money. You don't track it. Then God, that it's the divine. It's up to God, the gods, to give you merit at some point. So it's about accruing merit. Some people say it's about avoiding future incarnations, so you can be totally free of your body. Or people give you different.
Is that like the panhandler on 17th and K?
What do you mean? He's been incarnated.
When I give him something.
Yeah, that's done, right? You shouldn't ask whether he's going to go buy booze because you've given you've given. And people say that the recipient, and I haven't figured out how to translate this into this particular chapter, but the recipient shouldn't say thank you. It is the giver that should say thank you, because
I'm doing this for my benefit.
the giver is
not so
getting
much for his.
it's the giver that's getting the blessings. But when you're trying to ask recipients to follow through and to track, you're asking for the recipients have to be accountable. So it's kind of topsy-turvy in that context. The language of the gift is not translating well. Our Western
Time for
language.
one.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I'm still kind of developing, but I'll just throw it out there. I was more interested, sort of as an anthropologist, how do you approach the first part where you talk about the impulse to give? And I'm saying when you give to someone that's on the street, and just as someone, I'm sure many of you have faced the moral challenge of being in a position, or should I give or should I not? Because I know that I'm giving, I'm not really changing anything. And how do you approach it as an anthropologist of studying that that's part of the system of giving? And just the challenges of representation and that come about in sort of covering that aspect of giving.
How do I approach it ethnographically?
Yeah, and
To the
just
field?
how do you study that? How do you write about that in saying that there are strategies in asking for money on the street? And in trying to understand sort of what it involves and what does it mean as someone outside, this person's asking for money, their strategies are in that, but not misrepresenting or, I guess just, I don't know.
Yeah, there's one person who's done a really interesting study on lepers in South India begging, and how they use the performance of begging, right? How they use aspects of their body to get gifts. So there are some really great studies on beggars and even relationship to beggars and givers. But my context was really people who would say, well, we're not doing that, right? So that was one. It was something that they would define their actions in contrast to that. But people give. Many people give. When you drive down these urban New Delhi, and you're in your car, and people are literally, pounding on your window, and some people roll down their windows and they keep change around, and some of it's religious giving. There are certain days that you give for their certain gods, and some of it is not. And doesn't preclude, if you give that way, it doesn't preclude that you don't give to another kind of a charitable organization. One thing that I think is important to note is that in the context of New Delhi, in India, poverty's in your face. in a way that we just don't have here, especially in smaller cities where Milwaukee, where I live right now, is one of the most segregated cities in the country, and the poor people live over there, and the not poor people live over here, and they don't really intersect very much. So that's the impulse, I think, is by being I think the impulse is partly by being confronted.
This has been an amazing talk. Thank you so much. We have the opportunity now to speak more informally and in smaller groups over dinner. It's in 270 ICC, so I hope everybody will join us.
Thank
Thank you.